Hello, we are here once again to enjoy our meal. Welcome to Physics Meal. Today on Physics Meal, we'll be looking at the concept of what? Measurement, part 1 of it. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Mathematics Meal 1 and then follow us on Facebook at Mathematics and Science Meal. Also search for Engineer Ike Okechukwu on Facebook. You will see a lot of videos on mathematics, physics, chemistry, and so on. Alright, without taking much time, let's begin our journey today. Now, the concept of measurement is a very important concept, not just in physics but also in sciences, because without measurement we cannot do a lot of things in sciences and physics in particular, because we are talking about physics now. So in the concept of measurement, we consider quantities, we consider dimensions, and we also look at what? Units. So we'll begin with the first one. So we'll be looking at quantities. All right. Now we know about quantity, but many don't know quantity in relation to physics. Yeah, literally we know what quantity means, but as far as physics is concerned, many don't really understand what we mean by a quantity in physics. So let's define it this way. A quantity, or let's say quantities, so let me use the plural form. Quantities are physical constants or variables that can be measured. So any measurable physical constant or variable is what? Is a quantity. So any physical constant or physical variable that you can measure, so anything you can measure is what? Is a quantity. So quantities are physical constants or variables that can be what? That can be measured. Physical constants or variables that are measurable. That's what we mean by what? What we mean by quantities. Okay, so when we talk about variables and then constants, you see, a constant is any quantity that cannot change. Yeah, a constant is a quantity that its value will not do what? Will not change. But a variable, we have changing what? Values. So every quantity will either be what? A constant or what? Or a variable. So from time to time you hear people say, give me some quantity of water. That means the person wants you to measure certain amount of water, or quantity of kerosene, or quantity of petrol. So you see, whenever we are talking about quantity, it deals with what? With measurement. So any constant or variable which you can measure is what we know and we refer to as what? As a quantity. Okay, now we have two types of quantities. We divide quantities as far as the concept of measurement is concerned. We divide quantities into two, which are fundamental quantities and what? Derived quantities. So we can say that quantities are divided into two. So quantities are divided into two. What are they? Let's name them. We have the fundamental quantities and derived quantities. So fundamental quantities and derived quantities, they are the two types of what? Of quantity. So a quantity will either be a fundamental quantity or a quantity will be what? A derived quantity. So let's look at what we mean by a fundamental quantity, and then we also look at what we mean by a derived quantity or derived quantities. So let's look at the first one, fundamental quantities. So we say that fundamental quantities are quantities that do not depend on other quantities for their dimension. So any quantity that will not depend on another quantity for its dimension is a quantity we call what? Fundamental quantity. So you will still have dimension to look at later. So a quantity that is independent of other quantities in order to obtain its dimension, such a quantity is called what? Is called a fundamental quantity. So fundamental quantities are quantities that do not depend on other quantities for their what? For their dimensions. Now we have 7 fundamental quantities. We have 7 fundamental quantities. Fundamental quantities. They are, we have mass, we have length, we have time, we have temperature, we have electric current, we have amount of substance, and we have luminous intensity and luminous intensity. So these are the 7 fundamental quantities. What are they? We have the mass, we have time, we have temperature, we have electric current, we have amount of substance, and we have luminous intensity. So there are 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the word and 7. So 7 basic quantities or 7 fundamental quantities. Now it is important for us to note that there are other forms of length. Length is a fundamental quantity. So there are other forms of what? Length. There are other forms in which length can exist. And those other forms are also what? Fundamental. Let's take for example now. So let's note it. Note that quantities like, when we say breadth, width, height, depth, radius, diameter, thickness, distance, displacement, extension, wavelength, amplitude, okay, circumference, let's have circumference, and perimeter are the same as length. Thus, they will have the same dimension as length. So all these quantities I mentioned here, they are also length. So they are fundamental. Distance is length, height is length, thickness, displacement, extension, wavelength, amplitude, circumference, radius, diameter, all these are length. All of them are length. So if they are all lengths, then it means that when we start looking at the dimension of length, it means that distance will have the same dimension as what? As length. So not when you will see any of these quantities and you now say, they are not fundamental because you did not see them among these 7 quantities. Yes, these are the fundamental quantities, 7 of them. But length exists in different forms, and the different forms in which length can exist, that's what we just listed here. I hope that is very clear. So all these are also the same thing as what? As length. Okay, now let's look at the second type of quantity we call derived quantity, B. Derived quantities are quantities that depend directly or indirectly on the fundamental quantity for their dimension. So any quantity that depends either directly or indirectly on the fundamental quantities for their what? Dimension. Such a quantity is known as what? As a derived what? Quantity. So any quantity outside the fundamental quantity now will be what? A derived quantity. Any quantity that is not fundamental will now be derived quantity. So any quantity that you cannot find among these 7 quantities, that's one, then it is not part of any of the 7 quantities that we have mentioned. Like, you know, I've already said that radius is length, breadth is length, width is length, height is length. So any quantity that is not part of these fundamental quantities, that quantity is what? Is a derived quantity. So let's look at the examples. Examples of derived quantities. Examples. What are the examples of derived quantities? There are so many of them because we have so many quantities. Area is a derived quantity. Volume is a derived quantity. We have density. We have speed. We have velocity. We have acceleration. We have force. We have momentum. We have impulse. We have moment of force. We have pressure. We have work. We have energy. We have power. Oh, there are so many of them. We have surface tension. We have surface tension. We have viscosity. And so on. All these are what? All these are derived what? Quantities. So all these quantities you are seeing here, they depend on the fundamental quantities for their what? For their dimension. All right. We are going to go on a break, and in our next class, we'll be looking at the concept of dimension. I know that so far you now know the meaning of quantity, you now know what we mean by fundamental quantities, and you now know what we mean by what? Derived quantities. Till I come your way next time, keep enjoying our meal on physics, on chemistry, and other subjects. Remember, I'm still your friend and your brother, Engineer Ayuk Okechukwu. Thank you, and God bless you.